Hey, good morning, everyone. Delighted to be able to welcome you here for panel number 5, looking at Iran, India, and Malaysia. We've had very interesting discussions from the previous panels, both yesterday and today, looking at the role of Iran from its geopolitical perspective, and we've also looked at issues such as civilizational character and the political economy relations and how they are potentially going to be emerging in the future. But we're joined here by 3 panelists, and the first speaker is Chuchu Zhang, and where is it? Sorry. Yeah. Oh, yeah, thank you. Our first speaker is Chuchu Zhang, who is an associate professor at the School of International Relations and Public Affairs at Fudan University. She will be speaking on the topic of China and India as rising Asian transactional players in the Middle East, with a case study on Iran. Chuchu, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes.
Good morning, everybody. Today I'm so happy to be here in Doha, and it's a great honor to be here. Thank you for the organizer. My name is Chuchu Zhang. Today I'm going to talk about the roles of emerging Asian powers, including China and India in the Middle East. So today we know the growing roles of Asian powers, particularly China and India in the Middle East, has been a heated topic in recent years. Many scholars even believe that maybe China and India's increased geopolitical involvement in the region will bring forward a so-called Asian century. Also, given the escalating tensions between China and India over border issues and a lot of other disputes in many aspects, it seems possible for many to assume that the Middle East is going to become a new arena of China-India confrontation or competition. So to determine whether these concerns are well-founded or not, so this research aims to analyze these couple of research questions. So the first one is, how have China and India understood their respective roles in the Middle East? And the second question is, how do regional powers view the new roles of the two powers, and do their presence fulfill the expectations? Today, an increasing number of international relation theorists apply the so-called role theory to analyze the competition between big powers. And following the constructivist logic, role theories basically, they focus on 3 important elements. So basically, what is role theory? It's very simple. So it focuses on 3 particular elements. The first one is domestic role conception. So for instance, China, so it cares about how what China is going to do in the Middle East, how China understands its own role in the region. And the second important issue is external role expectation. So for instance, how does the Middle Eastern political actors receive China's role? What do they think, and what are their expectations? And then we come to the last element, that is role performance. It means that, okay, after China tries to establish its role in the Middle East, and after the region receives it, so in the end, how China performs, is it a failure or is it a success? For instance, if, China, tries to establish a role, but if the region has different expectations, then in the end, it may create problems. That is what the role theory is about. But if you read all this kind of literature applying this role theory to explaining China or India, you may find that there are shortcomings. I would say the first shortcoming is that, after all, now let's just look at the slide for 3 seconds, please. And then you can see how people are used to describe China's role. For instance, people are saying economic promoter, peace contributor. So do you find the problem here? What is the problem? It's, of course, you can use these terms to label China's role, but you can also use this term to label the other actors as well. For instance, you can say, okay, Japan is an economic promoter. You can also say South Korea is an economic promoter. After all, who is not? And so actually, after all, very few powers would say, okay, I am not an economic promoter. And nobody's going to say, I am a troublemaker, right, in the Middle East. Actually, nobody's going to claim so. So the problem with all these kind of literature is that they are using very vague terms to describe things, which is actually can be applied to all of the actors in the region. And I would say that there is another shortcoming of this literature. That is, if you portray the ancient giants' roles as regional, like hegemon, or like a rival of the United States, then there's another problem, which is that you assume that the Asian powers, new emerging powers like China or India, they have, long-planned, predetermined strategy that how they're going to work in the Middle East. But actually, sometimes we'll find that this is not necessarily the case. In fact, both China and India's contemporary foreign policy behavior becomes particularly abstract and ambiguous sometimes, and particularly when it comes to the Middle East. So in short, I would say that the existing role theory literature assumes that a political player will act according to a script, right? But actually, in fact, if you watch the movies, you will find that, well, yes, most of the movies, how do they work? So there is an actor and actress, and they are just playing according to a script, but sometimes it may not necessarily be the case. Sometimes they can just act improvisedly. And so actually, today, the role theory literature fails to explain how international political players may behave if the player does not really have a predetermined, well-written script, or if the script they follow is there, but it's very vague, it's very improvised. So here, drawing on the transactionalist behavior theory, so my research identifies both China and India as transactionalist player in the region. And so what does it mean by saying transactionalist actor? Here I would say that they have, different, characteristics. For instance, I would say that first of all, you will find that actually when developing international role conceptions and formulating foreign policies, you will see transactionalist players, they are good at, doing the low cost and high achievement stuffs. So they are not ready to take a big risk in that case. And the second very important thing is that we have to note that actually both China and India as transactionalist players, they are connected to domestic concern. So for instance, when you try to analyze their political behavior in the region of Middle East, don't forget to talk about their domestic, concerns. Sometimes a foreign policy is directly connected to what happened in both countries. And the third thing is that we have to bear in mind transactionalist players, they are likely to, they prefer bilateral negotiations over multilateral talks. And as many of our panelists has just mentioned today, both China, India, and a lot of Asian powers or the global Eastern powers, they have created a lot of multilateral mechanisms. But we have to bear in mind that most of these multilateral mechanisms are more symbolic. Actually, people may prefer to negotiate things bilaterally. And why is that? Because what transactionalist players want is not a fully written script. What they are trying to do is to give themselves more flexibility, more leeway. So what they are doing is, okay, through the bilateral negotiations and to come to a result, then this gives me more flexibility. And if I want to change or adjust my policy, it's easy, right? Okay, and so here, so in my analysis, when I talk about China and India, there is a time frame, and basically I'm talking about China under the presidency of Xi Jinping, and when I talk about India, it's basically in Modi's era. And here, So when we talk about both powers, I would say that, first of all, actually there are a lot of commonalities between the two Asian powers. And the first one is that both China and India seek to become conditional supporters of the prevailing regional order. What does it mean? So today a lot of literature are talking about China's challenge to the regional order. But actually I would say that China is not against the current regional order dominated by the United States. Instead, what it is not satisfied, as Professor Fulton has just mentioned, is its own position in this order. And actually for India, it's quite the same. India is satisfied with the current state of the international politics in the Middle East, but it works hard to change its unfavorable and passive position in matters involving its own interests. And the second thing is that the two powers share a common role as reciprocal global South partners. And the third thing is that today both India and China strive to continue displacing balancing acts to avoid taking sides in regional conflicts. Again, this is kind of like a transactionalist approach. And why is that? Because if you deal with both sides, then you give yourself more leeway, more flexibility, and you give yourself a leeway to change in the end. It's not that, okay, I'm always against you, I'm always with you. No, everything is going to be changed. As my colleague has just mentioned, nothing is impossible, right? And so for China, for instance, is trying to make a balance between its relations with Iran and Saudi Arabia. And actually for India, it's the same. It's trying to keep its relations with both sides and with both, for instance, Palestine and Israel. And here, now we can come to the case analysis. And in this research, we focus on Iran in particular. Due to the deteriorating relations between the United States and China, today the rising Asian powers accelerated the dynamics of trade, investment, and economic cooperation. For example, Beijing has signed a 25-year agreement with Iran. And also, as we know, China has provided support for the Iran nuclear deal, as many panelists have just mentioned, even after the United States withdrew from the agreement. And all these things lays the groundwork for the expansion of the bilateral partnership between China and Iran. And as for India, it was cautious not to criticize the United States since they have good relations with each other. But we should also bear in mind that India did not applaud the decision of the United States withdraw from JCPOA as well. So you can see that actually both sides, both China and India, has kind of like similar approach to the region, to Iranian issues. And also we have to bear in mind that today there is a challenge for both China and India, which is that if you deepen your interactions with Iran in this context, then first of all, you are likely to risk the United States sanctions. You are likely to, trigger or provoke the United States. But on the other hand, you're also going to maybe trigger disapproval or disappointment from the GCC monarchies, right? So despite the Asian powers offering reciprocal support for Tehran, we should not overestimate their intention and the capacity to remake the regional order. And in fact, I would say China's conditional support for Iran mainly serves as an extension of its domestic demands within China for lifting sanctions and allowing free business transactions. So for instance, if you watch the TV and if you see, Chinese spokesmen are criticizing the United States policy towards Iran, then probably it's not because China wants to, support Iran itself, but in many cases, the more important thing is China wants to protect its own interests in the region is because it's not satisfied with the way the United States is affecting its commercial deal with Iran, for instance. And meanwhile, we also have to bear in mind that both China and India discreetly play their roles as proactive regional balances between Iran and the Sunni bloc led by Saudi Arabia. I'll give you an example. For instance, today we are talking about the BRICS, right? And you see China promotes both Iran and Saudi Arabia to become BRIC members. It doesn't want to, displease any side. And you will find, very interestingly, actually this also applies to India. So, for instance, when India makes a joint, statement with Saudi Arabia, how it describes the role, how does it describe the partnership? It will say, okay, so India and Saudi Arabia have civilizational ties, right? But then, several days later, when India is going to formulate another agreement or like statement with Iran, it's going to use similar expressions. It's saying, okay, India and Iran are civilizational connect, right? So basically, to conclude, I would say China and India's expanding presence in the region does not really challenge the current US-dominated regional order. And also the rising Asian powers' behavior logic is very different from that of the established power. If you say that the established Western powers in the Middle East, actually, they usually have a real script, I would say that probably India and China has a completely different approach, but we have to bear in mind that sometimes no strategy is a strategy. So by emphasizing short-run mutual benefits on specific issues, both China and India learn to play their own limited strengths without causing themselves needless troubles. And the last issue is, interestingly, both China and India have played comparable roles in the Middle East. So, for instance, when regional conflicts of interest arise, China and India strive to avoid escalation of tensions. They're not going to engage in confrontation, as they frequently do in the other issues. And why is that? So although China and India have a lot of competition over a lot of issues, but not in the Middle East, and they both know how to contain themselves. And why is that? This is not only because the Middle East does not represent an essential interest for either Beijing nor Delhi, but also, like, the most important reason is that both rising Asian powers, they are also fully aware that only the region's complexity and diversity will secure each of their own expanding roles in the Middle East. I'll leave it here, and I look forward to further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zhang, for that excellent presentation. I think it's a great start for the panel. Our next speaker is Dr. Deepika Saraswat, who is an Associate Fellow at the West Asia Center at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis at New Delhi. She'll be speaking to us on From Bilateralism to Regionalism, Transformation of Iran's Look East Policy under Raisi.
Thank you, Chair. Let me start by thanking the organizers. I'm so glad to be here in this conference. So I'll be talking about, I've modified the title a little bit. So I'm going to be talking about how Iran's multilateralism has changed from Rouhani to Asian multilateralism under Ibrahim Raisi in the context of Iran's Look East policy. So multilateralism, despite the liberal, institutional aspects, is actually a strategic choice made by self-interested state actors, and it's not a static preference. The trend or the how multilateralism is envisaged it's not a static concept. It changes the trends and preferences around multilateralism. They change with the change in the international order. So just quoting Robert Murray here, that the structure of international system at any given point in history will impact if and how states use multilateralism as a strategy. What kind of order states strive to create and negotiate, what norms they focus on, and will shape how, the multilateral arrangements and institutions that they participate in. So under Rouhani, the view of their view of international system was one where it's moving towards convergence, mutual interdependence, and there is a decline of hegemony, and there is a new conception of power. Which is basically ideational and soft power that is accessible to larger pool of states. So hence, with this view of international system, the Rouhani administration pursued its policy of constructive engagement, trying to desecuritize, normalize Iran's international relations. And to some extent, with the signing of JCPOA, they'd been able to argue that international system is not just hegemonic or source of threat to Iran's independence and sovereignty, but also presents opportunities for Iran to play a role for its own, to enhance its own status and its own interests. So with this view, they justified a balanced policy of expanding relations with both East and the West. But with the US withdrawal from the JCPOA, the multilateralism remained very much in focus, but now with it was more in Iran's outreach to Europe to remain committed to the JCPOA and China, that it was framed as these players coming together for shared defense, their shared interest in defense of multilateralism against US unilateralism. So it was two rival visions of international, how international relationships should happen, that, that one based on cooperative international law-based, and the other one based on relative gains and hegemony. And then, more interestingly, as a previous panel, there was a mention that with Iranian President Rouhani being present in Qingdao SCO summit, and the negotiations for 25-year agreement between Iran and China starting after a gap of 5 years since 2016, we see that Iran-China relations were being framed more in terms of their geopolitical convergence and normative convergence even. So here we have a quote from Jawad Zarif saying that China-Iran share a vision of sovereign states with independent foreign policies across the Asian continent being connected and prospering together. So here the emphasis on is, it's important to note the vision of sovereign state with independent foreign policy. So that says something about how Iran was seeing the emerging Eurasian order and the role of China and how Iran wants to integrate with it. So when the 25-year agreement, when the news break out in media in a very sensational way, and there was a lot of domestic debate in Iran. So the foreign minister justified this agreement that was being negotiated, not just the traditional logic of responding to the US sanction pressure, but also the systemic power shift towards the East. At the same time, there were some important domestic factors. First is, here on the slide, we have a quote from Supreme Leader Khamenei on the eve of presidential elections, where he said that those calling on the country to normalize, that is, becoming closer to international norms, were essentially rejecting revolutionary concepts in the name of transformation. So this gave a further boost to the principalists who've been suspicious of the reformist and moderate outreach to the West. And so the ideological revivalist turn that became very much clear with the this articulation of second phase of Islamic Revolution in 2019, the 40th year of Islamic Revolution, that these ideological and these delegitimizing of diplomacy with the West, that further gave with the principalists coming to power. Coming to Iran's turn to Asian multilateralism. Now, this is something which has received more and more focus, the Asian multilateralism, with the Iran's approval of membership in the SCO. And then here it's important to look at the new understanding of the international environment as far as Tehran is concerned. First is with the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, Iran and all other players concluded about the US declining ability to shape the regional order, and also the increasing awareness of the change of the international system with the rise of China and also a more assertive Russia. But here it's important to see that that Iran does not see China's rise or even Russia being assertive, this Eurasian Economic Union and the CSTO, not as hegemonic, but as increasing salience of security multilateralism in Eurasia. So here Iran sees a role for itself in this multilateral kind of order that's emerging. The institutions that are there, SCO, Eurasian Economic Union, BRI. So Iran sees them as alternative to the US and Western leadership and a form of rival regionalism which can create a more equal, more democratic or multipolar kind of international order. So again, here Iran sees a potential for a more horizontal or rather decentered kind of multipolar order, where there are simultaneous emergence of multiple players like Iran, like China, Russia, and India. So this simultaneous emergence means that the order is not going to be kind of a hub and spoke, centered around China, but more a decentered and inclusive order. So coming to Iran's vision of Eurasian order, which is mainly the crux of my paper, I am going to talk about three aspects. One is the focus on civilization in articulation of a new Asian identity. So Iran sees Asia in terms of a plurality of or diversity of civilization, diversity of cultures. This is mainly to first to legitimize Iran's own religio-political system as based in its civilizational heritage. So that's one. And then second, it's about, Iran also draws upon a vision of, harmonious civilizations, that have coexisted historically in support of a more cooperative and inclusive order in Asia. And at the same time, this Asian multilateralism is very much is articulated as a more autonomous and a collective approach to issues of security and development, and at the same time limiting the influence of West containing NATO and the United States. So that's also the idea of in terms of emphasis on Asian multilateralism. Second is the development security nexus. Previous panel, we heard about China's vision of developmental peace rather than democratic peace. I think Iran also very much shares this notion in the sense it sees that BRI and these connectivity initiatives can address some of the development deficit in the region, and it sees that this democratic promotion that those projects that US tried to do in Afghanistan or Iraq, they've failed. So the answer is that there is a more collective approach to the issues of security and development. And here there is a potential for cooperation among the regional, all the key regional actors. And also here is how Iran says that the sanctions that are imposed by the West on Iran are not just aimed at hampering Iran, but also they promote obstacles to regional harmony. So hence there is a need for a regional response to tackling of these sanctions. This is, in my opinion, a very important aspect to understand how Iran sees its role in the region, that it articulates itself as a bridge. this is a quote from President Raisi's speech at the Shanghai SEO Summit, where he said that these three initiatives, One Belt, One Road, Eurasian Economic Union, INSTC, they can play a role in strengthening common interests of developing countries and strengthening peace in the region. They are not competitors, but complement each other, and Iran is the link between these three projects. Now, this, I think this articulation of a bridge role allows Iran to navigate the dynamics of geopolitical competition between the rival actors, where it can emphasize more on the geo-economic and the the connectivity aspects, and try to downplay the rival, the geopolitical aspect of it. So at the same time, by connecting with all these initiatives, Iran will be in a position to sort of limit the asymmetry of interdependence that it currently has vis-a-vis China, and at the same time, by having all the all the three key actors able to play a role in Eurasia, it can shape a more favorable and balanced order in Asia. So coming to how this has recontextualized India-Iran ties, yes, Iran's growing ties with China and have implications for how India frames its ties with Iran. So here I have listed a few developments. One is, for example, in 2019, Tehran said that Chabahar, which is being developed by where one port berth is being developed and operated by India, is can be connected with the Gwadar port, which is part of the CPEC, and CPEC runs through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. So India says it's a violation of our sovereignty, and hence India, has taken objection to CPEC. So this kind of connection, when Tehran spoke about, in India it was seen as something that was in response to India complying with the US sanctions on Iran. But at the same time, it was Iran's sovereign decision. So, I mean, it's Iran's sovereign decision, so that's there. But another development a year later was India's exit from the Chabahar-Zaidan railway line. And this also coincided with the news of Iran negotiating a 25-year agreement with China. Now, these Iran's deepening ties with China do, and at the same time, India's deepening engagement with U.S. and its regional allies in the Gulf does create a perception of as if India and Iran are experiencing more of a divergence. But I would say that's only partially true, because India also sees that Iran, which is playing, a role of gateway while, allowing India access to Central Asia, and also Central Asians to have more diverse access to international markets, and also the cooperation that India-Iran have developing in the Caucasus. So this gateway role is something that India appreciates as fostering more geo-economic balance in Eurasia. And secondly, India also has interests in Iran being very well integrated in the region rather than being isolated and then potentially falling into the Chinese geopolitical orbit. So that ways, New Delhi also sees that Iran that is well integrated in Eurasia is good for India's geopolitical interests. Third, that is, again, I want to emphasize that though India is collaborating with the US and its regional allies in the I2U2, which are not very, security oriented, they are more geo-economic, technological cooperation, more regional alternative in the, this era of transition. But India very much has its own independent and strategic view of Iran. So that's one point. I conclude here that that to understand Iran role in Eurasian order, we have to see that Iran is interested in fostering economic linkages with all the key Eurasian actors. And this is aimed at consolidating Iran's status as an independent regional player, also foster a more, not just a post-Western, but also a post-hegemonic and cooperative order in Eurasia. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for that presentation. So now we'll move on to our last panelist, Dr. Rowena Abdul Razak, who's a lecturer in Cold War history at Queen Mary Westfield University of London, and she'll be speaking to us on consistency through instability, Malaysian-Iranian relations from the Pahlavis to the Islamic Republic. The floor is yours, Rowena.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chair. Good morning, Salam Sejahtera, and my sincerest appreciation to the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies for having me here. Special thanks to Professor Kamrava, and a very special thanks to Hamide and Mutaz, as well as the other conference helpers who have kept this event afloat. I'm truly impressed. It means a lot to me to present alongside such amazing scholars, especially my fellow panelists, Drs. Zhang and Saraswat. I must say that I've learned more, and I'm going to leave you with more questions than answers with my presentation, so bear with me as you follow my own train of thought. Today, I hope to contribute by sharing some insight on Iran's Look East policy with regards to its attitudes and relations with Malaysia. Ties between the Persian Gulf and the Malacca Straits go back centuries, and I'll do my best to make sure this doesn't sound like a history lesson, but it's just important to know that these traditions go back a long time, and there is a lot of Persian influence on Malay culture and language. But in the present day, Malaysian-Iranian relations have yielded a new kind of exchange in the field of commerce, geopolitics, culture, and even sport. When we think of Iran's foreign relations, its interactions with smaller but no less significant nations such as Malaysia have not been explored in as much depth, especially in comparison to China, Russia, India, etc. But I argue that it offers a lot in terms of understanding how Iran is looking eastward, how it behaves internationally as an independent strategic player, and how pragmatic it can be. And indeed, Malaysia proves to be a unique case in this point. In this regard, I'm reminded of the keynote speaker's basket of frameworks with regards to Malaysia, and I see Malaysia as a kind of template of how Iran behaves internationally and the kinds of frameworks that you were mentioning in your paper, Your Excellency. So Iran and Malaysia, needs to be said, are both Muslim nations, but they have pursued very different political paths. Politically and historically, Malaysia has been more aligned to the West, and apart from the 1980s, when Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad pursued his own Look East policy, Malaysian governments have ensured that policies remain and maintain a kind of pro-Western stance. And even when it comes to Iran, which has included the adoption of sanctions against Iran and is subject to US scrutiny with constant monitoring on Iran-Malaysia commercial and political relations, especially from the US Embassy in Kuala Lumpur. This makes the interaction somewhat limited on the side of Malaysia. Furthermore, Malaysia is a majority Sunni country where Shiaism is regarded as deviationist. However, despite this, Iran has maintained positive relations and attitudes to Malaysia and its leaders. And vice versa, despite a strong attitude towards Shiaism domestically, Iran is seen as an important friend, strategic partner, ally, and Iranian businesses and individuals have been able to somewhat thrive, albeit limitedly, in Malaysia. So this paper examines why the characteristics of this relationship has remained and is in fact endured historically to the present day. It begins with the establishment of the relationship during the Pahlavi era, when official ties were established. It then gives an overview of how Malaysian and Iranian foreign policies have evolved before looking at the post-1979 relationship. It looks at how much of the Islamic Republic's attitudes were a continuation of the previous period, but also shows how the relationship has stayed consistent despite external and internal pressures. Being a historian by training, I've made use of archival materials, historical events, politician statements to unravel the paradoxes that are inherently present. Namely, it's the relationship's ability to withstand global Sunni-Shia tensions, Malaysia's pro-Western stance, and Iran's predominantly anti-Western outlook. I think a historical perspective is important, so I hope this contributes to our overall discussion here. The relationship can be best described as multi-tiered, with appealing to different needs on both sides. There's on one level the ties between the governments, strong, showing deep signs of deep cooperation, and earnest desire to keep relationship strong, active, mutually beneficial. Of course, this goes through different phases depending on leadership orientation in both cases of Iran and Malaysia. Then there's another level, which is Malaysia's, as I've already mentioned, hostility to Shiism coming from the religious authorities and the Malay Muslim community. These create some undeniable tension in the bilateral relationship, which has to an extent been ignored in order to prioritize the symbolic and strategic importance of the Kuala Lumpur-Tehran relationship. And then, indeed, there is also Malaysia's society's interest in Persian culture, be it poetry, art, carpets, travel, tourism to Iran is very popular. Conversely, Iran relies on its relationship with Malaysia for a sense of international recognition, participation, and stability, especially during periods of domestic instability in Iran, high economic tensions with the West, and so on. These tiers help to explain the relationship as a whole and hints at the complexities that exist. Of course, not to mention the ever-present challenges of Malaysia's domestic attitudes, the limited nature of Malaysia's interactions with Iran as dictated by its closeness to the US, and it's depending on its appetite and energy and how much it wants to pursue that relationship. So just here, Iran's formal relationship, the modern relationship, begins in 1968 when Mohammad Reza Shah made an official trip to official trip to Malaysia together with Thailand and Singapore. This was quickly followed by an exchange of ambassadors and opening of embassies in Tehran and Kuala Lumpur. A new ambassador was even appointed on the eve of the revolution as late as 1978, indicating the importance of that relationship. The ties survived the revolution, and in fact, under the Islamic Republic, it has developed and increased with several high-profile visits between Malaysia and Iran. This has helped the relationship to keep going. Even during the Iran-Iraq war, Malaysian Foreign Minister Ghazali Shafi'i was sent to Iran in 1983 to strengthen political and economic ties. Each president since Rafsanjani, with the exception of Raisi, has made an official trip to Malaysia. And so we can see that the bilateral ties are very important and that there is an eastward perspective on both sides. I'm just showing you variations of some pictures just to show you the evolution of different policies. And one of the reasons why this relationship has endured is because of the foreign policies of both sides. Both Iran and Malaysian foreign policies have gone through various changes. Of course, with Iran, I don't really need to to tell you already, but just to understand that under the Islamic Republic, it has been characterized that Tehran is, has gone through many different periods of its international relations, especially through the 80s and the 90s, and with Khomeini. With the start of the Rafsanjani era, Iran has experienced a new period of its foreign policy, and there are keen attempts to end Iran's isolation, especially during the 1980s. And since then, every Iranian president has implemented their own policies and visions, depending on the faction that they hail from. And Iran's national identity has remained key to this foreign policy, with an emphasis on its ties to the Persianate world, which to arguably exists with its ties in Malaysia, where promotion of Persian culture and art is very strong and very present. Similarly, when we look at its relationship with Southeast Asia in particular, the relationship has remained fairly consistent, and these countries have proven to be present and helpful in times of difficulty and tension with the West. Similarly, on the side of Malaysia, since independence, it achieved independence and nationhood during the Cold War. And because of this, Malaysia originally aligned itself with the West. Unsurprising, since Malaysia was still relying on the British for its defenses. However, this was not always constant or dogmatic, and Malaysian politicians of the 60s turned towards non-alignment with the normalization of relations with Moscow and Beijing, for example. And under Mahathir in the 80s, I think most of you may be very familiar with Malaysia's own extreme expression of non-alignment with its own Look East outlook, which dominated the 80s and 90s. And under the watch of Mahathir, Malaysia starts to look eastwards, especially to Japan, to emulate, and this policy becomes a very popular model for Asian development and a defining characteristic that makes Mahathir an important figure in Asia and the Middle East even today. And this very stance in the 80s actually explains why relations with Iran were pursued despite the revolution, despite the war with Iraq, and so on. As some of you may know, Malaysia is a multiracial and multi-religious country which practices a form of power sharing among the major racial groups. Islam is the official religion, and because of this, naturally there have been different polls about how Malaysia should approach the world. With the Malay Sunni Muslim population as the majority, they hold the major positions in government, such as Prime Minister, and so on. With this dominance, Islam came to play an important role in foreign policy, especially in the last 30 years. Since Mahathir, Malaysia has pursued a more involved role in the Islamic world and has become and was involved very much in conflicts involving Muslim countries, especially Palestine and Bosnia. And his successor, Mahathir's successor, Badawi, moved away from an originally confrontational attitude towards the West to a more modernist and moderate approach with his concept of civilizational Islam, which in some ways echoes Khatami's own dialogue among civilizations campaign. So you do see the characteristics between foreign policies of Malaysia and Iran, and that they share these kinds of developments as well through the Cold War, the post-1979 period, alignment with the West, followed by confrontation, and then somewhat moderation. So now you can see that these crossing points can be very much noticed, especially with both countries' emphasis on religion, national identity, third worldism, and Asian development. So to go into a little bit of detail about these crossing points, which may help to explain the enduring nature of the bilateral relationship, in Iran's outlook towards Malaysia, there are several discerning and fascinating overlaps, especially with regards to the Muslim world, Asian geopolitics, and the importance of religion and national identity in international outlook. Cooperation between KL and Tehran have survived a revolution, radicalization, the entrenchment of extreme Sunni values in Malaysia. And in terms of Southeast Asia, which has been an important area for Iran's, even before the revolution, and has helped to shape Iran's attitude towards the third world. For example, in 1958, Iran attended the United Nations Seminar on Regional Planning in Tokyo, during which time it officially interacted with Malaysia to discuss common issues such as development, economic, social and administrative planning, as well as the need for regional cooperation, something that has endured and has been accelerated in the present day. Southeast Asian Nations Organization into the body of ASEAN has been incredibly important in making the region take a collective approach to decision-making, characterized by consultation and agreement, while adhering to an informal and non-confrontational attitude. Known as the ASEAN Way, this approach to diplomacy in part explains why Malaysia's interactions with Iran have remained consistent regionally. Dr. Saraswat talked in her paper about this, the importance of community and collective approach that Iran can participate in, and this, I think, is quite prevalent in the ASEAN dynamic. And the Islamic Republic has remained committed to ASEAN and the region, indeed, as a member of the Asia Cooperation Dialogue, and in 2018 becoming a signatory of the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, an international agreement that upholds the integrity of ASEAN, in addition to having an ambassador to the regional body. Iran has used such platforms to promote an alignment with non-Western players and maintain a kind of influence in Asia, especially in Southeast Asia. Religion represents the most complicated factor in the relationship, and I'm afraid I won't have enough time to go into it too much detail, but I think it's something that needs to be mentioned to an extent. Before the revolution, religion did not appear as an important pillar in the Shah's foreign policy, but he did develop relations with the Muslim world. During his 1968 visit to Kuala Lumpur, for example, he made a point to perform Friday prayers, which I think is quite an important picture. And of course, after the revolution, Islam, as already established, became an even more palpable force in the relationship. The rise of Khomeini and the toppling of the pro-Western Shah was regarded as a triumph of Islam and added to a growing movement of Islamic revivalism that was sweeping Indonesia and in Malaysia at the time. Malaysians were drawn to the revolution in the 80s, indeed. A delegation of politicians and ordinary observers traveled to Iran to witness the building of this new Islamic Republic. And in 1981, a Malaysian delegation went to Qom to visit various leaders to understand more about the war and about how Islam was forming politically. Malaysian politician Dato Ibrahim Ali, who is today a very active politician, even visited Khomeini in France. Here's a little picture of them together. And he penned a small book, Encounter with the Ayatollah, which sold very, very well and actually caught the attention of the Malaysian police, who were concerned about what that might mean for Malaysia as well. During the 80s and 90s, Malaysia and Iran have collaborated closely on issues pertaining to the Muslim world, especially on Palestine. In 1983, Mahathir hosted a conference on Palestine to discuss how Muslim countries could best show up for this cause, which Iran also sent a delegation to. However, in the last 30 years, there has been an entrenchment of anti-Shiite sentiments in Malaysia. But despite all this, there is still an important relationship that they seem to want to pursue, and they move away from this Sunni Shiite divide to collaborate at a higher level to develop the Muslim world to an extent. Yeah. So, just to briefly go through it, there is also and other aspects of Iran's relations with Malaysia in terms of commerce, in terms of oil trade as well. And there have been various agreements, but unfortunately, because of Malaysia's closeness to the US, this has not been pursued to a large extent. But nonetheless, there are still some areas of cooperation and exchange. Just last year, for example, there was in a very popular shopping mall in Kuala Lumpur, the celebration of the 25th anniversary of the twin cities of Kuala Lumpur and Isfahan. For those who have been to Kuala Lumpur, you might have actually been on Isfahan Road. There's also been some exchange in terms of sport recently between Malaysian and Iranian football club. To this end, I believe I've only scratched the surface of the relationship. There's more to say, and indeed, some work already does exist on the Iranians who do live and work in Malaysia. But to end, I'd like to briefly return to this layered nature of Iranian-Malaysian relations. Iran has clearly pursued pragmatism in its relations with Malaysia, choosing to respect the country's attitudes towards Shiism and its alignment with the West in order to prioritize the strategic aspects of the relationship within its Look East or Look ASEAN policy. While Malaysia is limited to an extent due to its closeness to the US and to its own domestic policies, the cooperation exists and leaves flexible room for growth, thus keeping both somewhat committed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdul Razak. That was a fascinating paper. We have, as time is limited, we have just time for one round of questions, just short though. But if I could ask everyone to please just make your question concise and no comments, please. So first question over here.
Thank you very much. Hessam Habibi here. My question to Dr. Saraswat regarding the rise of Indian nationalism. Do you think this might, with its Hindu characteristic, might influence the relations with Iran, which has also a strong sense of nationalism within sense of Shiite ideology? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Dr. Sajipur. Next question over here, microphone.
I also have a question.
Okay, but the second hand was here, sorry.
Thank you all. I think a very interesting panel. Two questions on Malaysia very quickly. I think one issue is development, and you didn't mention, I want your response on Iran and Malaysia being both member of D8, and you know D8 is a combination of Muslim countries who are also on the process of development, how it does go. Second, on this issue of Shiism, it seems that it is not a Malaysian, let's say, genuine outlook. It was imported from the conflicts in the Middle East to Malaysia, especially within the Syrian conflict situation. Is my reading of the situation right or not? Malaysian by itself is not an anti-Shia country. Now, on the two panelists, very quick question on the rivalry between China and, or the competition between China and India. I didn't hear anything about it, but obviously there is a competition. How this competition reflects in the Middle East? Thank you. Or in the Persian Gulf especially.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll take the last question up here then.
Thank you very much. My question is from Dr. Saraswat. Recently, we saw a new agreement between Iran and India on Chabahar port. That will solve some problems, such as referring to a specific court while a conflict. Also, we see the preference of India to reaching to Europe by Med Arab corridor. My question is, what is the importance of Chabahar port for India's Indo-Pacific strategy in the future?
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. So, Dr. Rowena, do you want to start?
Thank you so much for your questions and your comments. Yeah, Malaysia is committed to development in Asia, and Iran actually has quite a healthy relationship with not just the Muslim countries of ASEAN, but also the non-Muslim countries of ASEAN. I think it's a continuation of interest in promoting Asian developmentalism, and to promote cooperation between the Muslim countries in order to have this shared vision of modernity and development in Asia to some extent. But yeah, I will look into that a little bit more as well to understand that aspect of the relationship. Secondly, with regards to anti-Shiism or the attitude towards Shiism in Malaysia, it's quite a complex issue, and it's something that was introduced in the 90s. Because in the 80s, you can see very clearly that Mahathir and a lot of Malaysians regarded Iran not necessarily as a Shiite country, but as a Muslim country, something to adhere to admire, especially with regards to confrontation with the West, with regards to Mahathir's Look East policy. But in the 90s, that changes, and in some ways it is because of confrontation within the wider Muslim world. But also an entrenchment of Sunni values at the level of the religious authorities. In recent years, this unfortunately has become a little bit more tense, with literature sold in popular bookstores against Shiaism. So it's something that I think needs to be observed a little bit more. It is multi-layered, it is multi-tiered. There's no straight answer to that exactly about how bad. It also depends on where in the country you are. Urbanites are not so bothered about this, but in the religious schools, in the rural areas, it's a little bit more tense.
That's great. Thank you very much. Deepika?
Yeah, on the question about the influence of nationalism, especially Hindu nationalism, and how it plays out in relations with Muslim country like Iran, I would say no, it does not. The Hindu nationalism part of it, surely not, because these are relations with Gulf countries and Iran. They are very much driven by pragmatic national interests. But yes, there is another kind of nationalism that does come up from time to time, especially like the Iranian leaders' statements on Kashmir. That it does provoke kind of a response, not just from the government, but also at the level of society, like in the sense like not respecting India's territorial sovereignty. So yes, that does get a pushback. Coming to what Professor Sajjadpur asked us to comment on China-India competition. Yes, that is very much driving how India is engaging it, especially the the Gulf states. I mean, the I2U2 that we hear a lot about. I mean, it's about India finding more convergence with the United States in terms of integrating the region. The Arab Med corridor is part of that. So there is a lot of quick movement happening there, especially after the Abraham Accords and Iran, Israel, UAE, coming together on these questions. So yes, that's very much informed by how India and US both have interest in integrating the region and creating regional alternatives before China can like really dominate the region economically. So yeah, that geoeconomic logic is there that's bringing India together with the US and its allies. And I did mention that in the presentation. But on Iran also, I see, like, of course, Chabahar, India's interest in developing Chabahar was to access to Afghanistan, but also, in China's, sort of development of these ports all around the Indian Ocean littoral and in Gwadar in the Arabian Sea. So yes, Chabahar was very much part of this countering, Chinese inroads into the Indian Ocean, and that's there. And Chabahar, Indo-Pacific, I think. Yes, geographically, Persian Gulf is part of Indo-Pacific as far as India is concerned. But I think around the time the JCPOA was signed, there was talk of collaboration between Japan and India in Chabahar. So that's like bringing Indo-Pacific partners into Chabahar in that sense. But otherwise, I think India has just been very persistent in developing Chabahar. I mean, it's a story of half full or half empty glass. I mean, despite the U.S. sanctions, India got the exemption and has been consistent in developing the Chabahar port. So that's part of how we see our Indo-Pacific interests.
That's great. Thank you for that. Dr. Zhang, maybe you'd like to give the final comments?
Yes, so regarding the issue about China-India competition, thank you so much for this question. And basically, I agree with what our panelist Saraswat has just mentioned, and I just want to add maybe just 3 points. So first of all, indeed, there is some competition. I'm not going to deny that. And if you see the region from a broader perspective, you will see that, for instance, today, China hopes to maintain its relations with both the Arab world and Israel at the same time. But today, since the geopolitics becomes more complicated due to the deteriorating relations between China and the United States, and since the United States is a great ally of Israel, so today China is finding lots of challenges in Israel. And in this context, India is going to fill the gap. And on the other hand, regarding Iran that we are talking about, as our colleague has just mentioned, so yes, there is competition, for instance, regarding the Chabahar port. But the second issue, which is important, is that today, if you compare these two Asian powers, you will see that, okay, probably China has something like more leverages than India due to its investment capacity, due to its status as being a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, etc. But also we have to bear in mind that India has its own advantages. For instance, India has a big population in the Middle East, and also it has a great impact in regions like Afghanistan. And lastly, another important issue is we have to bear in mind, although there is competition between China and India in the Middle East, but they seldom erupt into a real conflict of any real magnitude. I'm going to return to my core argument, which is the transactionalist, logic. So regarding this logic, I think three important issues are standing out. The first thing is that both China and India are trying to give themselves more flexibility so that they can always leave themselves a space to adjust their policies at some point. And the second important thing is both of the big powers try to accumulate more bargaining tools. So in that case, for instance, their investment capacity, their trade, influence can all become their bargaining tool. So only if you have these tools, you can really do the transactions and bargains with the region. And the last thing, last but not least, is both powers know very well that doing transactions is very important transaction opportunities. We have to maintain it. Today, in a lot of media coverage, people are criticizing transactions, saying that, okay, China is just trying to do transactions with Middle Eastern powers. But why not? Actually, the region is not worried about transactions. What is more worrisome than transactions is if there is no transaction opportunities. See what's going on in Iran after the sanctions imposed by the United States. So if there is no transaction opportunities, it may create more disasters. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I think on that note, and in the interest of not depriving everyone from their well-earned coffee break, I want to thank our panelists for their exceptionally insightful papers, and I think this will spur even more discussion later on. So please join me in thanking our panelists for their papers.